Hi, this is Rachel with Fiona Sandwich Patterns, and in this video we are going to be putting together the Crater Lake block. So if this is your first time foundation paper piecing, I would highly encourage you to start out with the National Park block that is in all of the patterns. That is the simplest, and then you'll be ready to put these together. So print out your kind of your map, your layout, so you can see where everything is going to go, and know that the map is the opposite. It's the mirror image of the back side of the template. So kind of your map, as I'm calling it, or your layout picture shows the front side, and we sew with the right sides together. So this is the back side. If you flip your template over, you can see that this is going to be the same thing as your map. So we are going to lay the pieces out. Let's see, I have A5, and then E goes up here. Let's see, then we have D and B, and I think C goes here. Yeah, that's correct. Okay, so then the next step that we are going to do is we are going to trim the edges of all of the pieces. And one thing, so D and E will go together first, so I'm going to just slide these out of my way a little bit. One thing that I say in every video, and I cannot emphasize enough, is that I always use this solid line as where I line up my 1/4 inch line on my ruler. So I have a dotted line that's marked 1/4 inch. So that goes on top of the solid line, and I use that instead of the dotted line. And let's see if I can hold this a little bit closer. What you can see is that sometimes the dotted line goes off to one side a little bit more than the other, and sometimes it's right on. So you might be tempted to trim around the outside like this, and I would encourage you not to do that. I would use a rotary cutter, and I would place your ruler on top of the solid line, have your 1/4 inch on top of the solid line, and then don't worry about the dotted line. Just pay attention to the solid line and then trim along the side of the ruler. And I don't generally do much with the tabs. I find that for smaller blocks they're not as helpful. For large blocks they really are a lot more helpful, but sometimes they get to be a little bit more of a pain in the rear. And another word of advice is, as you are sewing your blocks together here, all of your template pieces, when you get to any of these intersections here, I call this an intersection, where you have two solid lines that will be joining, try to stitch as close to that intersection as you can. Like if you can be right on top of it, that's better. You can see that this one I went over. I didn't like the way it was, that it stitched out. So you can see that I went over it twice. And the second time I was on top of the line more. If in these parts you're not right on top of the line, that's okay. But really make sure that in any of these intersections that you are right on top of the line. If you're not, it may throw off the block a little bit, and that's okay. I will show you how I fix that as I'm putting the block together. I might forget it, so I'll speak to that now. What I do is I line up the inside of the block instead of lining up the outside of the block. And you can see that I've left the little corner tabs there. There are a few ways that you can line up the blocks or the templates, and both of them work really well. The method that I prefer to use is I pinch on the side and put them together, but I'll show you both ways so then it's not quite as confusing. So the other thing that I do is I put just a little bit of glue before I trim the paper template and the fabric template, and what that does is it helps hold down the fabric so that it doesn't shift around. Another reason that I don't like trimming along the edges, I am trimming these, but it just kind of moves all over and it just becomes more irritating and more effort than it is worth. Okay, so we're going to put D and E together. So I'm going to show you my two different methods. And both of them work. The pinching method, which is the second method that I will show you, is the one that I prefer to use. So what you can do is put your templates together. So this is the first method. And I guess this is more common than my pinchy method. I didn't realize that it was. So what you are going to do is you're going to stick a pin in the intersection and make sure you're going straight down. And what you want to do is have it intersect at the next side where it would, so it comes to a point right here, and it's not a super sharp point. Then I put my pin down and I'm going to line up the second. Again, my pin goes straight down and I'm going to lift this up. Actually, I'm going to put a pin right here. I really do love using pins, and I line up the edge. This isn't lining up, so this is one reason that I don't totally love this. I don't totally love this method because they kind of wiggle a little bit. I forgot what I was going to say. So I'm going to just straighten this one out so that it goes where I want it to go. And that's pretty close. So I'm going to call this good. And the other thing that's always advisable is just peek inside before you sew to make sure that the right sides of the blocks are matching. Most of the time the letters should be going in the same direction, but that's not always the case. Okay, so then we're going to sew the first section. I have decreased my stitches to 1.6 millimeters, and I like about 1.5 to 1.6. This machine doesn't have a 1.5, so I just use 1.6. The needle is in the center of my presser foot, and there's just a little gap in my presser foot, and I use that as my gauge, and I keep the solid line right in the center of that, and I'm going to sew a little bit before to a little bit after, right along the line. Oh, I remember what I was going to say. I was going to say I love using pins because it keeps things right where they need to go. I don't like using clips as much because what happens is it shifts just a little bit. Again, for maybe a larger block, that might be something that's better, but for this, I really prefer to use pins. I know it takes a little bit of extra time, but I just prefer it. Okay, so then I take out my seam allowance tabs. I call these tabs. It's really just your seam allowance. Don't remove anything else because you will need this part to sew the rest of the block together. So I only remove the part that I have just sewn together. And I don't remove all of the paper. I just try to remove, like, 90% of it. And then I also want to remove these little pieces. If you have used glue to hold down your corner sections, any part that might be lifting, I use just a little dab of glue, and I just use the Scholastic a glue stick. Here it is. This is the one that I use. So then you will be able to remove these little pieces and still have this section attached. If you didn't use glue, then I would not remove like this piece here. And I don't need to remove any of these other ones because they're going to be sewn together later. So I'm going to press my seams. I think I'm going to press it toward D4, but because D4 doesn't have any other bulk, I'm just going to leave that. Okay, so then the next instructions say to sew C to D, so I need to trim same way as before. I say in most of my videos, but I don't know which one you have started with, that it's good to check your ruler to see if it is 1/4 of an inch on all 4 sides. This particular ruler has one side that is absolutely 1/4 of an inch, and then the other side that's a little bit shy. So I have just some little grips that I have on the 1/4 of an inch side, so then I remember which side is the one that I want to use. And I have all of these things listed in a blog post on my website. You can search for it on FionaSandwich.com. You can search for piecing essentials. There are some tips for foundation, or not tips, but products I like for foundation paper piecing and English paper piecing. Alright, so this will be nice and easy to line up as well. I think I'll show you my pinching method with A and B. That'll be a little bit easier so you can see what I'm talking about with the middle. So again, I don't necessarily use this little area as where I want everything to line up. I'm going to start with the outside of the block because I want to make sure that the outside has a nice square edge. And I'm going to put my pins down. Oops. And I am going to pin this as well. So hopefully those don't shift around. And this one is not quite where I want it to be. So I'm going to move that, and basically this is my pinching method. So I pinch right along the seam allowance, and then I look to see, is it going to line up? I guess there are 2 different things that I'm looking at. I'm basically folding over 1/4 of an inch, and I'm looking at the outside of the block, and I'm looking at what's going on the inside of the block to see if where this little intersection is right here, just right here, if that is going to line up, and it does. So that would be more important to me than the outside of the block lining up, because we have that 1/4 of an inch seam allowance on the outside that when the block is sewn with other blocks, it doesn't matter quite as much. If the outside of your block, if you've made sure the outside of the block is perfectly flush, but then it looks wonky on the inside of the block. Once you piece your quilt together, it doesn't matter if your block is perfect on the outside if the inside looks really funny. So I didn't like the way the place that the other pin was, so I took it out because I like my pinchy method a little bit better. One caveat to removing these little extra papers before everything is put together is that the block has a little bit of a tendency to shift around. So just bear that in mind, that you want to handle it pretty lightly so that you don't have much shifting. Okay, so same thing as before. I'm sewing a little bit before to a little bit after, right along the solid line. And if my foot gets off a little bit, when I come to an intersection, I just want to make sure that it is as close to that line as possible. And remember, an intersection is where the sew lines meet. And before I remove the tabs, I want to check and make sure things line up the way that I want them to, and I can see that they did, so I'm content with that, except for these little strings, which I can worry about later, but sometimes it's just easier to take care of them right now. And remove your little sewing tabby bits. And this is going to be one that I'm going to press towards C. In the instructions it just says press. Sometimes it says press seams open, but I have started just writing press so that you can decide if you want to press them open or if you want to press them to one side. Generally, I really like to press them open because it makes the piece look so much nicer. However, there's not too much bulk going on in this area. Let me see if I can kind of give you an example of that. If I press these this way, you can see that you have a little bit more shadow when the seam is pressed up toward E and D. But if I lay these down toward C, there's less bulk, and if I press them open, they just disperse really nicely. So I think because there's just a little bit here and most of it's going to be in the seam allowance, I'm just going to press it all toward C. But you can do as you wish. You can play around with it and decide if you prefer to have the seams pressed open or if you prefer to have the seams pressed toward one side. Okay, so we're going to set that aside for a moment and we're going to repeat the whole process with A and B. If you prefer, you can trim all of your blocks, all of your templates, I mean, before you sit down to sew all of them together. Either one is perfectly fine. And then once you become more confident, you can read ahead a little bit and you can chain piece like A and B together, and you could do D and E together. And I like to just clip these with my scissors, and I would encourage you that the only time that you would do this is if you have used a little bit of glue. Like I said, I like this one. It's a water-soluble glue, so it comes out when you wash the quilt together. Here's one that I have not glued, and you can see that it just kind of gets a little bit wonky. The fabric might move down and I might not cut it. It might shift and I might not cut it straight. So this is why I really like to use glue for all of the outside pieces, so then they just lay flat and they stay put. I'm not going to worry about gluing each seam as I sew it because it's really unnecessary. For pieces like these, they're not, these ones I've glued. These ones here I have not, because you're going to be sewing them on this one template. But when you sew two templates together, they're more likely to shift. So I joke that it's like kindergarten around here with paper and glue sticks and colored pencils. And again, I just cut on the outside of all the large pieces, and then I just trim these little tiny pieces with scissors. And sometimes it's necessary and sometimes it's not. So always make sure that your block is going in the correct direction. And sometimes it's nice to just take a look and see, where is this next piece going to be sewn here? So then you kind of get an idea of how it goes together and where the pieces will need to line up. And then I just like to take a peek inside to see, where are these supposed to line up? And this is how I use the pinching method. Because I'm a lefty, I use my right hand, and I just put my fingers right along the seam allowance. And what I'm doing is I'm looking to see if this is going to create a straight edge, because I don't really have to worry about what's going on the inside of the block. And that's something that you'll learn as you are piecing. You'll kind of get an eye for which templates it matters what's going on inside of the block and which ones it doesn't. But generally speaking, I use the pinching method because I feel like it's a little bit, maybe it's slightly more precise to have the inside of the block go together really nicely. So a little bit before to a little bit after, I haven't changed any of the settings on my sewing machine. The lovely thing about paper piecing is that the template creates all of your 1/4 of an inch seam allowances. So if you're not a super exact piecer, then this is going to be a really great method for you, because all of the hard work has been done for you already. You just line up and sew right along the line. Oops, I ran out of bobbin thread. Oh no. Okay, this is okay. So if you have that happen and you have removed your papers, don't do anything. Don't press it, just leave it. So line them back up. So you'll line up your edges. And definitely place a pin even if you are not a fan of pinning, because you don't want those to shift at all. The paper provides extra stability, and once you remove the paper, you've lost some of the stability and the integrity. So what I'm going to do is I am just going to sew right along the edge, the perforated edge that I've torn off. I'm going to go a little bit slower this time because I want to make sure that I am sewing right along that edge. Now, if you have a situation where you have had to remove a piece of fabric several times and the template has become weakened, what I would do is I would press it and starch from the front. And then you will be able to go back in, and I'd put a little bit of glue on that piece that, you know, you've removed and you need to sew back in. Let's say it was like A4 that I needed to sew back in. Put a little bit of glue on the back side after you've starched it. So that's really going to stabilize it. The starch is going to act like the paper does. It'll provide a little bit of extra stability. And then glue on A4, put it down, and then you have this line here that you can re-sew on. So this is going to be an example of one that I'm going to press open because it has a lot of extra stuff going on inside, and I want to make sure that these are going to really lay nice and flat. So when I put the whole block together and put the quilt together, it will lay the way that I want it to lay. Alright, so now we are ready for these two sections to be sewn together. And I kind of use the tab sections as kind of an eyeball place, but I really want to make sure that this island lines up. So I have laid it out on the table, and then I'm just going to go back and forth pinching to make sure these are where I want them to be. I think this is going to work. To check. The other thing that you can do is you can put a pin right here in the seam allowance, going parallel with the seam allowance instead of perpendicular. I'm going to fold this back. The other thing I'm looking at is if the bottom lines up. I think that'll be okay. Okay, so same thing as before. If you're concerned about your templates not lining up correctly, you can also do a based stitch, something that's a little bit larger so that you can see if they're going to line up, and then go back over it. You just want to make sure that you're not puncturing too many holes into the template. And this is also the reason why I don't score all of my lines, all of my sew lines before I start. I know that some people do. Actually, I think I'm just gonna remove this one. I know some people do, and I don't, because even though I design patterns, I'm really not a super sewer. So I'm liable to make mistakes, and I feel like if I have scored all of my lines, so all my sew lines, and I have weakened the integrity of the template, then I'm just causing extra frustration, and I don't really want to do that. So it's just easier for me to see. I'm trying to think, how do I want to do this? When you have all this bulk that is coming at one place, it does make it a little bit tough, but it's okay. All right, so let's talk about when something like this happens. This is bound to happen at some point in your sewing journey where you have pieces that don't match up. You know, it just happens. And it probably happened because of what I had going on here, and that's okay. We're going to make it work, and it's going to come out beautifully, and nobody will know the difference. Again, this is an instance where I'm more concerned about what is going on here inside of the block. You know, I really want this section to match up, that this part doesn't bother me quite as much. So let's go ahead and trim this, and then we'll talk about lining up template pieces when they don't match. It doesn't happen really frequently, but it's a good thing to know what do I do when they don't line up. Alright, and I'm going to leave this side open. I'm not going to trim up the top because I might need that little extra space just because of the way that these have come together. And you can see that this block is not one that really matters. It's not like this where there are lots of different things that are going on and I need to make sure that things line up. This is a really straight edge, so I'm going to take the two outside pieces where this does become a little bit wonky is that it needs to have a little bit of easing. So then you can do one of two different things. I can remove this seam and I can ease A5 so that it gives me a little bit of extra, or that's hardly any. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take I might regret this, but this is what I am going to do so that I have a straight edge. I'm lining up the outside up here, and I'm lining the longest part down here, and I'm just cutting a straight edge across. So if you have that happen, don't fuss too much about it. Figure out a way that you can make it a straight line. And I do need to ease this, so I want to have the bulk on the bottom so that the feed dogs just kind of help disperse all of that bulk. So then I will also put a pin in the middle. So there are two things that you could do. You could remove a portion of this seam and you can ease it and you can sew it together. Or you can cut a straight line and then you can put the two pieces together. I think those are probably the two options that I would take. Either one is perfectly acceptable. There's not a right. If you have another way that you would do that, there's not a right or wrong answer. So for this one, what I am going to do is I am actually going to switch, let's see, how do I want to do this? I'm going to switch to a 1/4 of an inch stitch so that I can sew along the outside of the presser foot, and then I always check my settings to make sure that I am right at a 1/4 of an inch. So the other thing to keep in mind is you may feel like you're wasting fabric if you take it out. If you have learned something, you have not wasted fabric. It might feel that way, but you've learned something and you've grown from it, and I would just hold on to it because you can use it later. You might have a really brilliant idea, and again, so long as you learn from, I wouldn't even call it a mistake, you learn from the process, you have grown and you haven't wasted fabric. I also try to sew when I am a little bit more fresh. I save my kind of my less thought-provoking sewing for in the evening with English paper piecing, just because that's a little bit more mindless. And before I remove these, I want to double check and make sure, and this turned out really beautifully. I think it's going to be perfectly fine. And this is one that I'm going to press toward F. So the other thing that I really like to do is I like to remove all of my papers before I give a final press, and with the final press I like to starch the block because I remove all of the papers. So I want to have extra stability, but I really do not care for removing a whole quilt's worth of teeny tiny papers. It really drives me crazy, so I like to remove the papers as soon as I'm done with a block. I kind of feel like it gives me a sense of achievement that I've kind of finished a goal, if you will. But for this video, I'm not going to starch it. I'm just going to press it one way, and then I'm going to, I think I'm going to measure the block just to make sure. The other thing that starching does is it helps the block to lay really flat. So if you have a block that's pretty good. I'm really glad that I left the extra paper in there. So then I have that little extra bit. So one thing with starching your block is it helps kind of flatten it really, really flat. So then you're, if you have a situation like this where the block just maybe hasn't come together quite as well as you had hoped, you can kind of use the grain to shift the block and to stretch it out just a little bit. And then when you sew your blocks together, then you have it more the size that you want it to be. The other thing that I really like is this Project Wool pressing mat. This one is really fantastic because you can press on a really high heat, and I do use steam on it as well, and I do starch on it, so it's a little bit discolored because it just kind of takes a beating, but that helps to kind of disperse the extra bulk as well. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I will see you in the next video. If you would like this pattern, check the description below. This is one of the monthly patterns in the monthly subscription, and you get 3 patterns, and they are delivered right to your Fiona Sandwich account. And I hope you really had a great time sewing this with me. I would love to see a picture of your completed block. Please tag me on Instagram at Fiona Sandwich, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks for joining me. Bye-bye.